We're back in Calvin's Tormentors by Gary W. Jenkins, and we're in chapter 8 today. And chapter 8 dives into Jérôme Bolsec. In this chapter, Jenkins turns his attention to one of Calvin's most vitriolic and personally driven enemies, Jérôme Bolsec, who, unlike the earlier opponents, whose critiques we looked at in prior chapters were mostly doctrinal, political, or at least ecclesiological nature, Bolsec's attacks on Calvin were deeply personal, and they went on over and over for decades, culminating in one of the most notorious posthumous character assassinations of the Reformation era. Jenkins begins by situating Bolsec within the religious and intellectual context of the mid-16th century Europe. Bolsec was originally a Carmelite monk. He was trained in the scholastic tradition of Roman Catholic theology. Bolsec's background as a Carmelite monk meant he was formed in a sacramental and contemplative tradition. His eventual departure from the order and alignment within the Reform movement would have required a very radical break from a deeply institutional and sacramentally focused theology along the lines, in addition to their deep Marian adoration. Jenkins subtly underscores this to suggest that Bolsec's background may have made Calvin's doctrines, especially his doctrine of predestination, particularly intolerable to him. At some point, Jérôme left the Roman Church and made his way into Reformed circles, though never with any official pastoral role. By the 1550s, Bolsec had reinvented himself as a lay Protestant and as a physician, settling at one point in Geneva, where he attended public worship and mingled with the city's theological elite. Quote, "He was no ignorant crank," Jenkins says, "but he was a man whose training in both scholastic and medical reasoning made him confident, dangerously so, in his own grasp of the divine will," unquote. After abandoning his life as a Carmelite monk, Bolsec re-entered secular society and shifted from theology to medicine, a field that allowed him intellectual status and, of course, economic independence. Jenkins writes that after, quote, leaving the religious life, he became a physician and later practiced medicine in Geneva, Lausanne, and elsewhere. And by the early 1550s, Bolsec was practicing medicine in Geneva. Jenkins emphasizes that Bolsec was respected enough to serve as a physician in various Reform cities, though his temperament and his polemical tendencies made him a poor fit for stable pastoral or academic roles. Later, after returning to Catholicism, Bolsec continued practicing medicine in Lyon, reportedly earning a good living, despite his growing literary reputation as a polemicist. Bolsec's medical identity gave him some form of credibility. He was not a theological amateur, nor a street agitator. He was educated, methodical. He used his intellect to dissect not just bodies, but Calvin's theology and Calvin's personal life. And that's what made him especially dangerous in Jenkins' view. He wasn't dismissed as ignorant, but rather resented as a rogue intellectual with the tools of argumentation, but not the spirit of reform. His time in Geneva was short-lived. Jenkins portrays Bolsec as an outspoken, volatile personality, someone with a penchant for conflict and a need to be noticed. What set Bolsec apart from other dissidents was not his theology per se, but his willingness to publicly challenge authority in disruptive ways. There's an example in 1551, which was the defining moment in Bolsec's relationship with Calvin. And it was during a sermon, which wasn't preached by Calvin. It was preached by Claude Kopp, one of Calvin's close colleagues. And the subject was predestination, which is obviously a core tenet of Reformed theology and the doctrine that was loathed by Bolsec. In the middle of the sermon, Bolsec stood up and interrupted the preacher, declaring that the doctrine was heretical and slandering Calvin's interpretation of it. The The outburst caused immediate scandal. Geneva, which had suffered through factional chaos during the Libertine controversy, was not so inclined to tolerate more open dissent within the church's worship service. Bolsec was arrested, and then he was later questioned by the consistory. Geneva's Calvin, despite not having been present at the sermon, took the lead in articulating the theological response, compiling citations from Scripture and the Church Fathers to defend the Reformed understanding of election. According to Jenkins, this moment crystallized the broader issue. Bolsec was not merely a theological opponent, but a destabilizing figure. His behavior was seen more as a threat to public order and unity of the church. So no physical punishment was administered, but Bolsec was banished from Geneva. The experience, however, obviously didn't silence him. It galvanized him. So after his expulsion from Geneva, Bolsec drifted once again back towards the Roman Church, but this time more quietly, returning to the fold. He re-entered Catholic life now he had a sense of purpose. He would destroy Calvin's reputation, and he'd do that through print. Jenkins devotes considerable attention to Bolsec's most infamous work, La Vie de Calvin, published in 1577, The Life of Calvin, and this was 13 years after Calvin had died. So, while ostensibly a biography, loosely using that word, the work functioned primarily as a vehicle for Calvin's character assassination. Bolsec's life his life of Calvin is filled with claims about Calvin's alleged immorality, Calvin's pride, his dishonesty, his cruelty. Jenkins catalogs a list of the most outrageous of these accusations, that Calvin had suffered from syphilis, that he had killed Servetus out of envy, and that he had died in despair, abandoned even by his own followers. The sheer volume and emotional intensity of these charges led Jenkins to observe that the life of Calvin was less biography, this is a quote, less biography than bile. It was not grounded in careful research or substantiated sources. It was rather constructed as a kind of judicial brief, with Calvin as the accused and Bolsec as both prosecutor and judge. But what made the work so damaging was that it masqueraded as serious scholarship. Bolsec furnished it with citations, legalistic phrasing, various appeals to authority, all of which lent some form of credibility to what was essentially polemic disguised as history. In Jenkins' view, what makes Bolsec so troubling is not merely the venom of his accusations, but the enduring impact of his version of Calvin's life. Despite its evident bias and unreliability, Bolsec's Life of Calvin became the source book for anti-Calvinist polemic in the Catholic world. And more disturbingly, it was also picked up by secular Enlightenment critics of Calvin like Voltaire and Rousseau, who, like Bolsec, echoed the most salacious claims as though they were established facts. Jenkins points out the irony. Though Bolsec was largely discredited among serious Protestant and even many Catholic theologians of his own day, his myths outlived his credibility. The slanders entered the bloodstream of Reformation historiography and shaped the public imagination of Calvin for generations. Indeed, the most effective torment is the one that lingers. Calvin had many enemies in his lifetime, some of them brilliant theologians, and some of them were respected scholars, but Bolsec's legacy is unique in its posthumous reach. He didn't win any theological arguments in his lifetime. He created a caricature that others could use to bludgeon Calvin long after his death. In the final pages of the chapter, Jenkins does not attempt a nuanced rehabilitation of Bolsec. While Jenkins acknowledged his intelligence and learning, Jenkins portrays him as someone driven not by passion for truth, but by personal resentment and failed ambition. His theology, Bolsec's theology, as it was, remained shallow. His contributions to Reformed thought were non-existent. His enduring accomplishment, if you can even call it that, was the successful contamination of Calvin's memory through his ongoing falsehoods. Jenkins concludes that Bolsec is a cautionary tale, a man whose rage at exclusion turned into obsession and whose talents were ultimately deployed in service of defamation rather than reform. His attacks did not spark doctrinal clarification or ecclesiastical renewal. They just gave Calvin's enemies a tool to slander him in perpetuity. So, in conclusion, chapter 8 of Calvin's Tormentors offers one of the most personal and disturbing portraits so far in this book. Jérôme Bolsec was not just a failed theologian or even primarily a rival reformer. He was, in Jenkins' estimation, a tormentor of Calvin's legacy, a man whose war against Geneva's doctrine morphed into a lifelong crusade for revenge. His story stands as a sad reminder that truth is not always what survives, and that sometimes the loudest voices are the least deserving of a hearing. Jérôme Bolsec, in many ways, is the 16th century prototype of modern YouTube polemicists. Someone that knows a handful of words to sound credible, enough bitterness to fuel a following, and zero interest in honest engagement. What Bolsec did with the printing press, modern polemicists do with a webcam and a Wi-Fi connection. So while Bolsec attacked Calvin with slander from the shadows, long after Calvin's death, our next tormentor comes at him from face to face, with his Bible in his hand and his chalice on the table and Luther's ghost somewhere off in the distance cheering. Chapter 9, we meet Joachim Westphal, the little hot and fiery Lutheran who decided that Calvin's view of the Lord's Supper wasn't just wrong, but damnably dangerous. For Westphal, Calvin wasn't a reformer with a few Swiss quirks. He was a Zwinglian saboteur masquerading in a scholar's robe. So if we say Bolsec was Calvin's bitter defamer, Westphal was his sacramental prosecutor, and charging him with doctrinal heresy and staging a confessional trial through a bunch of pamphlets and polemics and various public letters. So in our next episode, that's Calvin's Tormentors, chapter 9, Joachim Westphal and his Eucharistic throwdown that rocked the Reformation. Stay tuned.